Miigwech. I'm going to introduce myself with my spirit name. Memeshkwe Gabawik, Nindishnakaz, Adik Nindodem, Opwaaganisiniing Nindonjiba, Nibin Nindonji. So I said my spirit name is Standing Strong. My clan is Caribou. I'm from the Red Rock Indian Band, and I live here in Nibin. So I live in heaven here in Northern Ontario. I'm about 45 kilometers south of Thunder Bay, the airport, and I'm about 10 minutes from the Minnesota border. So I'm really close. So I'm in two traditional homelands here. We've got the traditional homelands of the Fort William First Nation and the traditional homelands of the peoples on the other side of, the border. Now there's a border there. There was never a border before, but across the river, across Pigeon River. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm a grandmother to three little ones. They're 5, 6, and 7, which is going to change very shortly. Their birthdays are coming up. And a mom to 5 adults. And I do lots of different things. I'm very connected with land-based activities. That's my love. I provide life coaching. I do a variety of things. I never really know how to describe myself because I never know what I'm going to be doing from one day to the next. And I'm really grateful to be here and grateful for the invitation. Miigwech.
Right on. Great. So I think we'll just dive right in. Cindy, in terms of talking about Indigenous ancestral foods, I'd like to know, what does that mean to you? Because I think some of these terms are new, even though we're going back to old terms, they're new to us today. So, and probably different to each of us based on our own environment and cultures and things. So what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I do, I guess, imagine or dream, or I receive guidance on what our villages looked like in the past. So before contact. And of course, everyone in the village had a role to play and everyone was important. And our villages were very nomadic. So we didn't really stay in one place for too long. When it was time to harvest the wild rice, we would move to that area. When it was time to hunt the caribou, they would move to that area. So, so the peoples were moving usually from season to season to different areas to harvest the foods that were plentiful at that time. And of course, each region would have different things that they would harvest also, whether it was animals or plants growing on the land. I know I've seen some archaeological sites that illustrated how the peoples would trade from way up here to way down, the Gulf of Mexico and even further south. It just blows my mind how far the peoples would travel to have these trading, to do this trading. And of course, they would gather. It would be a feast for many days. They would spend that time together. So they would have certain areas that they would go to and travel to at different times of the year. They didn't stay, not like today where we have a house and we stay in our house for years. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that back then.
And I think okay, so that was a great response too. And it's interesting because I think Indigenous people globally were nomadic because of seasons and things that were ripe and not, and where things grew around. And it's kind of interesting to think about traveling after food, like, you know what I mean? Like they're just sort of running after food all the while, and then gathering in those places, probably different groups of people would come together. When I think about it, and that would be a celebration. You come together around a certain time of year, and now that becomes a tradition. Because you're all coming for the blueberries or the whatever's that's there.
Exactly. So and I think that's where the powwows came from, because You know, you would have had these seasonal gatherings and probably lots of visitors from other regions would have come, other traditional homelands. And so, yeah, so I don't quote me on that because I'm not a powwow informed person, but I sort of think that that's where the whole practice came from, was from that.
I'm with you on that, because if you look into tribes and different villages, I should say, in Africa, they have the same, it looks like a powwow. Like, I've been to lots of powwows. They look very similar, you know. They're using different feathers and things based on the animals that are there.
That's
And
right.
they very much go by, you know, your clan is based on, like, you live near alligators, you're the alligator people, and then you're generally the people who can speak to the alligators. You understand the alligators best.
Right.
So it's very fascinating when you start to share stories and see just how similar things always are, really.
Well, yeah, because we're all essentially from one tribe. So
Amen.
of course there's going to be similarities.
Yeah, definitely. All
Yeah.
right. So then I wanted to ask you what types of foods from back then were they eating that are still real consistent on the table now? Like indigenous.
Well, again, yeah, it depends on where you're living. So again, it would depend on the regions and what's available. But you know, so I'm close to Thunder Bay. If you think north of Thunder Bay, those northern communities that are only accessible by air, some of them are accessible by road now. It is changing.
Hmm.
But, you know, they're essentially eating the same wild meat that they ate in the past, essentially. Maybe they're preparing it a little differently, but essentially it's the same foods that they were eating before. The downside, though, is for those communities is that because the government has put them in an area that's not really hospitable, let's say, to gardening or anything like that, you know, they're buying foods from the Northern Store. It's called the Northern Store. And yeah, it's mostly foods that are not really good for them.
Right.
So the foods that aren't good for them, it's plentiful and they're cheaper. The foods that are good for them are not plentiful. They've traveled so far, they're not really nutritious anymore, and they're horrendously expensive. So you've got those two sides. But yeah, I think if you were to look at even in Ontario, each area in Ontario, I think essentially people are still eating the same wild meat that they ate before. Like I said, maybe they're just preparing it a little bit differently. Like, you know, some people will make moose meat or deer meat into sausages. I don't know that they did that, you know, before contact. I'm not sure that
Right.
that was a thing. Maybe there was a similar practice, but yeah, they're preparing foods a little bit differently now.
Right.
So yeah, and then the
So, and
wild
what do you
rice.
think of people that are in the urban environment, like say people that are in Kitchener or people that are in Toronto, where they're not getting that wild game, or
Yeah.
are they still like connected to their families and their communities where they are still eating that, or are there certain things that they still would be eating? I guess that's what I'm after. Like,
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would say that, yeah, it's probably much more challenging for people living in Southern Ontario, because how much access do you have to wild game?
yeah,
But maybe they're still connected, excuse me, to their home communities, and maybe they're still accessing it that way, because I do hear of families, you know, that live in Southern Ontario that will go home for a
yeah.
couple of weeks in the summertime, and you know, maybe they're accessing it that way and able to still have those traditional foods
Mhm.
with their family. And of course we do know that many of the foods that we had before, they are being revitalized now. So the culture is coming back, and many of those practices are coming back. Because I remember years ago attending a wild rice demonstration at the university where they were showing people how the wild rice was harvested and then how did they prepare it for eating, which is a fairly lengthy process. So yeah, I think those practices are coming back slowly.
I have heard people say that they're going north for a family gathering and they're going to smoke salmon or something. It's a tradition that they do. And in fact, at one time I was in Vancouver and I was doing a conference there, and they had it catered by an Indigenous caterer. And so we had wonderful things like wild blueberries in our salad and smoked salmon, that the process that they tell you. And they do it, their catering is a family. So the family gathers together and, gets the fish and processes the fish, and just fascinating and really, really wonderful. Are there any dishes like, my husband has this bread, I forget what it's called, bannock bread.
Bannock.
Bannock. So bannock is one thing that people, I know Indigenous people are still holding on to that one. I know we love it in our house because it's real easy to make. Maybe is that something that you think that people in urban areas would still be eating something like that? And I really don't know what other types of dishes would be considered Indigenous other than, from the land, really. Maybe you could share.
So I mean the traditional foods are the ones, like I said, the wild game that they were harvesting, things like wild rice, the Three Sisters, wild potatoes, wild onions. I mean, there's lots and lots and lots of food that they were eating, but it was mostly protein. They were eating mostly protein, and so that's why we're
meat,
having
you mean from meat?
Yeah. And this is why we're having so many issues now. But I wanted to share with you that bannock is not actually a traditional food.
Is it not?
It's not. People call it a traditional food.
Every time I go to a powwow, there's bannock.
I know.
So
I know, but that actually came after contact, because the Scottish people would make like biscuits or scones or something like that. And that's, I believe, where the bannock came from. It wasn't actually a traditional food, because remember, we didn't have flours.
Right.
We didn't have any of those white products that are causing us
corn flour.
Why we're having so many health issues today is because of all these white products that have been introduced into our system. As an example for myself, I can't remember what the ingredient is in alcohol. I don't know if it's the sugar. I can't remember. Is it sugar? But there's something in alcohol when it's being made. It's almost as if my body is allergic to it. And I think that's where a lot of our problems are stemming from, is because our bodies can't handle those processed foods. Yes. And the processed ingredients. And so, yeah, I think that's why. I know some people will go, yeah, actually, that kind of makes a lot of sense that we would be allergic to alcohol, that we have. It's like a food sensitivity. Yeah. I develop a flush on my skin, and you can actually watch it rising up on me as it's covering my whole body. It's a food sensitivity.
Right. Yeah. I think that's what we call colonized foods and colonized intervention of foods, right? Where we start to see more of this kind of processed stuff and not so much from the ground. And that's when the whole industrial farming thing came in, where we had this idea that we were going to produce more and it was going to be better and they were going to feed the world, when in reality, we just took all the nutrients out of the food and the soil. right? And so you can create food from that, but there's not a lot of nutrition in it. And those wild
No,
foods, even if we were to today start to eat wild foods, they say that you could only put a little bit in your diet at a time because your body's not ready for all the
that's
nutrients like
right.
that. It's too powerful for you, you know.
Yeah, but so if we think about those five things, those five white gifts that came from contact, like the flour, the sugar, the lard, the milk. We didn't drink milk. Salt, baking powder, those kinds of things, that wasn't in our diet. And so, the diabetes that we're seeing, the cancers that we're seeing that are so prevalent and just destroying our people, to me, that's why, is because we're putting so much of that processed food into our body. And for myself as a vegan, I'm an anomaly amongst indigenous people
for sure.
because I don't eat meat and I don't do dairy. Because if people were eating their traditional foods, it would mostly be the wild game. That would be the bulk of their diet would be that.
Yeah, yeah, and even in African places, we can't process dairy either. It just wasn't in ours.
Yeah.
And funny enough, in our diet was more ground provisions, fruits and things like that, and not so much meat, very little meat. So I don't know if the game was just too big. You're not going to go out and hunt a lion today or something. I don't know, but they didn't eat a lot of that kind of stuff. And I mean, that definitely was a colonial interjection into
Yeah.
indigenous life that was not beneficial to
No.
communities. But then I mean, that is the food of now. So it's not just indigenous, or it's everybody's eating this really over processed
Yeah.
foods. And we were kind of sold this lie that it was going to help us and be better for us in the long run. And we have children now who don't even know what things look like unless it comes in
In a
package.
box. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty sad. So I'm really glad to have this kind of conversation because as food is a very passive activism, and we can all agree on food. We all have different aspects to bring to the table of food,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a place where we can all agree. So I think yeah, these kinds of conversations are really good, and also to get us thinking about what were we. This is the reason why I wanted to do this presentation is, what were we eating? Is it necessary that we eat more of those kinds of things given where we are? And we're probably a generation or two now away from where we didn't have any processed foods, because as you know, when I grew up, we never really ate out. We once in a while, like it was always home food, and you always cooked everything from scratch because there was no other
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
that which looked like a chore now looks like a health regime.
Yes. And hopefully we're going to get back there. Because I've got this up on my board. Actually, food is medicine. And when we're eating whole foods that are not processed, you just feel like you're taking that medicine into your body, and you just feel so good. And you start to notice you don't need to eat as much. Maybe 1/4, 1/3 of what you normally eat sustains you and sustains you longer. And of course it's much healthier for us. So yeah, I'm sort of on that kick myself right now, and really trying to stay away from processed foods, even processed vegan foods.
Yeah, because
try,
there's that
try,
too, right?
yeah,
There's
yeah, trying to get
non-meat
back
and
to, yes,
all
yes, like,
kinds of
oh
stuff.
my goodness, because they always try to make things easy for us, but then it harms us in the long run.
It
So
really
yeah.
does. And even the fact that we have to say whole food now, like when we used to go to the store, that's what it was. It was
Yeah.
whole food. So you didn't have to look
Yeah.
for organic. You didn't have to look for whole. It was all included, right? Now we got all this other stuff. Yeah, it's crazy. So, and we've already started to talk about the health implications of that
Yeah.
kind of a diet on us. And I think we're all starting to figure out that, I mean, and it's not to say that we always have to be on target, but mostly if we are, like, we're going to have pizza and we're going to have these kinds of things. And it's not to cut yourself off from them, but it's to let go of this idea that, that it's easier, that it's more accessible, because if you're dying in the long run of it, or you're getting sick, or you're just foggy, or you just, you know, in the
Yes.
short, in the long run, it's really, really not worth it. So, um,
No, and I mean it's been at an epidemic epidemic portion for I don't even know how many years.
yeah,
And it's just so disheartening to see individuals that have lost their limbs, they're on dialysis 3 times a week, trying to survive. And so for the people in the north, they have no choice but to move to an urban center because it's the only way they're going to get their medical services, or they make that decision and they're going to pass in their community, before their time. But yeah, the diabetes situation and the cancer, whew,
oh wow,
just awful. And then addictions follow along with that, because again, we're not putting good food into our body. And for the people in the north, they really don't have any choice,
yeah,
because they only have the northern store. That's it. That's all they have, other than wild game. So now sometimes they might travel to an urban center and shop for some foods, but again, it's cans of stuff and bags of stuff. It's not, it's not whole foods that they're able to take home, because how are they going to keep them?
yeah.
They're not able to keep them, to store them. So it's such a
And they say that your
challenge.
gut is your other brain, right? So gut brain health.
Yeah.
So if your gut is unhealthy, your brain is unhealthy. You know, if your gut's not doing well, your mind is foggy, you're depressed. All of those
Yes.
other things come from that if you're never getting any of that kind of food. And I experienced that. I lived in North Carolina one time years and years ago, and my son was less than a year old, who's almost 27 now. And went into a corner store and was looking for orange juice or apple juice, 100% juice, and there was only orange drink
Right.
and fruit punch. And I said to the owner of the store, or whomever was working there, like, do you have juice? And he's like, yeah, it's right there. And I'm like, no, juice, not drink.
Juice.
And he looked at me like I had 10 heads, like, we don't have that here. And I thought, wow, that's interesting, because any convenience store I go to here, I can always get apple juice, or even at a gas
Yeah.
station. But in the States, it's very localized to who's in that community. Just like when we say, if we go north, oh, it's mostly indigenous people
Yeah.
there. So that's all that's available to them. Whereas you come here, there's Sobeys, there's, you know what I mean? So it's not to say
Yes.
that there's the variety of need there, but definitely the need for whole foods.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. And to get us back outside, and to get us back, get our hands in the dirt, and get us back to having that experience of going outside and harvesting something out of your garden, and then bringing it in and having it for a meal. Oh, it's so special.
It's
It's so
so good, isn't it?
it's such good medicine for your body. So yeah, I'm just starting with a garden. I've had a medicine garden for the last couple of years, and then I grew a few vegetables last year. So we'll see what I can get into this year. But yeah, having that experience, right? I remember as a kid, my mom always had a garden, and she grew everything. She could grow anything in that garden. So I mean, even the food that you're eating out of that garden is much more nutritious than what you're buying in a store. Like you said, buying organic, right? I buy organic, and you notice that price tag when you go to pay for it,
Do
because
you ever? Yes.
it's getting so expensive. But I'm not going to change. I'm not going to change, because I notice a difference in the taste and the texture of the food between regular and organic. So I will continue to buy organic.
And it's like you're making a health choice every time, right? Because
Yes.
you're not trading short-term food for long-term gain, when really in the long term your health will suffer.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like you're paying for that medicine. That's actually exactly why I got into food forestry, because I had 3 kids. I went to buy a container of raspberries. It was like $7 organic. Most people who garden will not plant raspberries because they take over your yard. So it seemed ridiculous that you would pay so much for this. And then this container, here, 3 kids,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
make sure you enjoy every single one of those raspberries. And you know how they grow in the wild, just raspberries abundance, right? And so that's when I started food forestry, because the idea of accessible organic food for everybody should be a right. And so when I build these veggies, they're food for all our relations and for community, and generally planting perennials. And so I have a structured food forest. And this year I'm planning on doing a medicinal. I want to just have all medicinal herbs in my yard. So
Nice.
I'm going for. I'm going to have to get some tips from you this year then.
That's so beautiful. Yeah, I was so proud last year that I had all 4 medicines in the garden.
Oh, wow, that is really something. Do you want to share what the 4 medicines are? Maybe not everybody knows.
Yeah, for sure. So there's sage. I could have pulled up some pictures for you. So not the sage that we would put in our foods. It's a different kind of sage. It's for smudging purposes. Sweetgrass, and there's tricks to know what sweetgrass is compared to regular grasses. And a good friend of mine provided me with a bunch of seedlings of tobacco plants. So we must have had 100 tobacco plants last year.
Wow.
And they grew so tall. It was so amazing. And then the last thing I was missing was a cedar tree. And it's interesting, this whole property, I still haven't seen a cedar tree. So I adopted 2 cedar trees that were being thrown out of their home. And I'm like, oh my God, well, I'll take that cedar tree. And so they're all covered up for the winter. I'm hoping that they're going to be okay when we uncover them this spring. But yeah, so the tobacco, the cedar, the sweetgrass, and the sage, those are the 4 medicines that I'm referring to.
Nice. And sweetgrass is not easy to grow, is it?
Well, once you have a patch, then you can, cut a little patch and you can easily transplant that to someone else's garden. And you can do the same with the sage. So yeah, you can easily transplant that once you have it growing. So I'm looking forward to the patches being a little bit bigger this year. Yeah.
I used to have a patch in the front, and it grew so big. It was originally my kid's wild patch, and then somebody had gifted me some sweetgrass, so I got the sweetgrass, I brought it back here, and then it just overgrew. And I asked my mother-in-law, which of this is sweetgrass? Like, I can't tell because it's very difficult. I know you got to do smell and there's taste, but even then, it's not easy. And you can walk by and smell it all day and never find it. So she said to me, I asked her, how much of this is sweetgrass? I have no idea. She goes, oh my gosh, the whole thing was sweetgrass.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
But then, last year I made the mistake of moving it because I had to get that space on my driveway, because I sometimes plant things on my driveway. So I had to move that off of my driveway, and they didn't come back. I'm going to check in the spring, but
hopefully they do. I'm sure they will. I'm sure they'll come back.
Send them some good energy and stuff, so my sweetgrass goes back.
But yeah, sweetgrass tends to be a little shinier than the regular grass. And the other little tip, besides the smell, as you've already pointed out, is the roots, the parts that's above the ground, they've got a little purple tinge to them. So then you can, you would cut it above the ground. You don't ever pull it out by the roots. And you could smell the grass. And like, once you smell it, you'll always remember what what sweetgrass smells like. And so that's how we distinguish it, because even harvesting last year, everybody's like, well, where's the sweetgrass? And so I would say, well, that little patch right there, that's sweetgrass.
And even, you know, I know that tip about the red bit, and even then, because some grass has that as well. So
Okay.
yeah, it's really something. But it's lovely if you can harvest it and you can find it.
I
Oh, the
know.
smell is next to none. It's
But I don't have it on the land, so I will buy it. But yeah, wild rice and blueberries, or wild rice and raspberries, is a very lovely dish. But yeah, there's lots of traditional foods that people are still having. And again, because I'm vegan, I don't do wild meat. I don't do any kind of meats, and I don't do dairy. And if I might, I'm going to share a video with you, if I can share it, to show you why I don't eat my relatives, because
this is in your backyard.
Right outside my window.
I hope to do more talks with you, because I just love sharing and chatting with you, and I love hearing your stories and your perspectives. So thank you again, Miigwech, Asante.
Miigwech, we'll see you soon.
Okay, take good care. Mwah.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.